All right, welcome everyone to another installment of The Way It Is. I am your host, David Andolfatto with RE/MAX Service First Realty here in Kingston. And today we have a guest that I am absolutely thrilled to have with me today. And some of you may take a quick second look and think that he's my other twin, but he's not. He's actually my first cousin, David Andolfatto. And I will go through his quick biography here, as David currently is serving as a senior vice president in the research division at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. He was a professor of economics at the University of Waterloo from 91 to 2000, and also at Simon Fraser University from 2000 to 2009, before joining the Fed in July of 2009. He's published several articles in leading economic journals, including the American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, and the Journal of Economic Theory. He's been invited as a visiting scholar to central banks around the world, including Bank of Canada, the Bank of Japan, La Banca de la República in Colombia, and I'm going to say that's from the Netherlands. I'm not going to try to bastardize the Netherlands way they pronounce their bank, and along with a number of other Federal Reserve banks. And in 2009, he was awarded the prestigious Bank of Canada Fellowship of Award for his contributions in the area of money, banking, and monetary policy. Now, David is, being my first cousin, his father is my uncle, and he was a native of Vancouver, Canada, and he received his PhD in economics from the University of Western Ontario in 1994. Good morning and welcome, David.
Buongiorno, cugino.
Non c'è male, grazie. So, and I think this is a real treat, because you and I get to connect in this way, which is fantastic. But secondly, because of your current occupation and what you do and where you are. Obviously, you're Canadian, but now you're living in the U.S. You've got your finger on the pulse of the economy, and obviously in Canada, when I started this podcast, we were in pandemic, and so everything has been pandemic centric essentially. So that's where I guess I want to start this conversation in terms of, when this came to me, what better person would be prepared to speak on what's happening in the U.S. Vis-a-vis the economy and how that's going to affect us here in Canada. So that being said, where are we at? Where were you guys pre-pandemic? Obviously during Trump's era, the election, through the pandemic, now post-pandemic. I'll turn it over to you. So,
well, first of all, Luca, I'm thrilled to be here. I'm actually a fan of your podcasts. I actually do watch them. So when you reached out to ask me to, it never occurred to me that you might want to talk to me. But I'm thrilled to be here. It's just great to see you. Thank you for the opportunity. Let's see. Let's set it up. I guess maybe I'll go back even a little bit further. I arrived at the Fed in 2009, and we were still embroiled in a very sharp recession from the financial crisis, like many places were. And, basically, to make a long story short, the recovery from that traumatic experience, we were just really fully recovering, just coming into the pandemic. So the United States experienced about a decade of a very, very slow recovery dynamic for reasons we could get into if you wanted. But it kind of reminded me of what we lived through in Canada in the 1990s.
Right.
In the early 90s, it was Canada that experienced a relatively more severe recession, and it took about a decade to recover. By the time the Trump administration came in, the economy was doing pretty well, and how much you can attribute this to just the natural healing process of the economy, I think a lot, and also to some extent to the administration at the time that was cutting regulations or re-regulating or cutting regulations, and also the fiscal packages like the tax cut, whatever. All of these things played a role. But the economy was actually doing pretty well. And also what's interesting actually was it was doing relatively even better for the lower income people. So people wages were starting to rise relatively rapidly for the lowest income, lowest level, skill levels,
Yeah.
and so the economy, the economic recovery was finally becoming broad-based. The unemployment rates across different demographics were coming down. Very low unemployment, low inflation, low interest rates, rising wages. I mean, it was actually the Fed was kind of, people at the Fed were relatively happy, kind of, that the Fed was, it appeared we were engineering kind of a soft landing, and then the pandemic hit, and so that was kind of interesting as well. So that's where we were. Pandemic hit. Do you want me to describe a little bit what happened?
Yeah, well, yeah, please, yeah, because I know, I mean, and just a quick interjection. I mean, obviously here in Canada, and I sadly cut my teeth in the 90s in real estate. I've referred to it often on this podcast where, when I started, it took an average of 120 days for a house to sell. The average interest rate in Canada, 5-year interest rate in Canada was 12%. So and then you're absolutely right. It was 1999 and I can track it right back when the market just started to do a steady incline and hasn't looked back since. It's like even in 2008, we didn't have that here into the degree that the U.S. did. But I guess, embarrassingly, the pandemic's the best thing to ever happen to real estate, obviously, in Canada. And so, yeah, take us through, where the U.S. economy is vis-a-vis, all those indicators, I guess. So.
Yeah, so where we are in terms of those indicators, I believe very much depend on the responses of the monetary and fiscal authorities at the pandemic, because when it hit in March of 2020, I mean, the first thing that hit was, there was great consternation in financial markets. And of course, this is going to be tied to real estate prices, interest rates. And I think to the Fed's credit, we learned a lot from the 2008 crisis. We learned in particular when something like this happens, you can't just diddle daddle. You got to go in. You got to go big. I mean, this is not the time to fine cut things. You basically got to go in and worry about details later. And we did. And many of our interventions actually were even just threatened interventions. Like, we're going to go into this market and stabilize the market for corporate paper or whatever, mortgage-backed securities. And in some of these markets, just the mere suggestion that we were prepared to intervene calmed them down. So the corporate sector managed to raise a lot of debt at low interest rates, even though the Fed did not directly intervene, for example. And then on top of that, you had the massive fiscal stimulus package, the CARES Act, that for the first time in history, during a recession, when production was actually declining, people were either were going laid off or staying at work for safety reasons. It wasn't that they were being laid off, but it was the shutdown period. For the first time, at least as far as I can remember, personal disposable income actually went up during the recession. Total income goes down, but personal disposable income goes up, largely because of the CARES Act. And of course, associated with this were the massive deficits, budget deficits. But that really, really helped people absorb the blow. And then subsequently, it's just basically been the recovery is basically, I think it must be the same in Canada. The recovery dynamic has really just followed the path of the pandemic. The certain sectors got hit relatively hard, kind of leisure and hospitality, for example. Yes. But what can you do? I mean, if people don't want to go to the casinos, or they don't want to go on cruises, or they don't want to take flights, it's not like you should be stimulating activity along that dimension. I mean, it was really an unusual recession, in the sense that it's kind of, in a sense, conditional on the pandemic. You actually wanted people to stay home and kind of for safety reasons. So it's very unlike the financial crisis where there was no reason to stay home. It was just. And so I think the U.S. is following, like many jurisdictions, it's just by and large following the path of the pandemic. There's a lot of heterogeneity across the states. These things come in waves and things like that. Different states have different policies. But in terms of real estate prices, as you know, I mean, and you mentioned it was one of the booms for real estate. I mean, the same thing here, right? I mean, I was watching real estate prices, especially for down in Florida, for example. I mean, it was just like insane. I mean, it was just absolutely insane. And part of this was, I think, also kind of work from home. I mean, people were partly, wanted places that could accommodate an office, more space. I mean, and that was part of the reason. But I mean, boy, what a boom time for real estate for sure. I think it's cooled off a bit, maybe. But,
well, I mean, I think in August, and I have these conversations every day, all day, and everyone has an opinion, and there's those that say cooling off. I would hesitate to use that sort of description. I mean, August saw no different than, and in the U.S. is different because your vaccination policies and people's how shall we say this? People's I guess thoughts around vaccination and COVID in general are different than here in Canada. We'll leave it at that. But I found where August, we finally provincially in most of the provinces entered that sort of what they termed a phase 3 or a lessening of restrictions, and people were now free to move around because vaccination levels had reached, a percentage that was accepted or that was, better. And so I think people actually's priorities shifted in terms of now we want to try to enjoy a summer after having been sort of in hibernation for the better part of 18 months and start to roam around and see people and see things and get out. So I think priority shifted. We're still seeing activity here, and I think it is more localized now for sure. I'm sure no different than in the US. So I guess, and that's where, I know, I mean, I listen to, I'm pretty religious watching the CBC, and I try to keep up with what I need to know. But I mean, the US is such a behemoth and yet it's such, the individual states do really act as their own entities at certain regards with regards to, so I think that differs from Canada, and you can certainly correct me if I'm wrong in terms of in Canada, as much as we have the provinces and the territories, there still is that overarching federal banner that I think ties us together perhaps more strongly than it does in the U.S. And speak to that if you can, in terms of how that affects economic policy and from the Fed level and what happens there. So.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, I'm not an expert in the history, but I've done some reading for Canada and the United States. But loosely, the history of the United States is, especially prior to the Civil War, it was a union of states, a federation of, state rights. I mean, the states guarded their own local power very jealously. And loosely, I guess the history of this country can be characterized as a growing degree of federalism, especially post-Civil War, when the United States became the United States, and it's just been an ongoing tension in the country about state versus federal kind of power. But this is not very different from Canada, by the way.
Yeah. And
it's important for us not to make, because you take Alberta, for example, which I often characterize as kind of the Texas of Canada.
100%.
The mentality there is very much kind of different. It is true that in Canada, Ottawa has much more power. I think the federal government has much more power than, say, the federal government here. I mean, with the the administration, Congress, and Senate and the House. But But still, I mean, the provincial governments do retain a considerable amount of power and over jurisdiction over things like, I guess, welfare, for example, and things like that. But I'll tell you, I mean, it's an ongoing. The tension I find interesting is, on the one level, when a crisis like COVID hits, you want a coordinated federal response. You want to coalesce all of the people of the country and say, okay. I mean, this is not, the pandemic's not hitting frickin' Missouri only, or Virginia, or Ontario. It is in fact, in this case, it's a global. I mean, ideally, one would have liked a global coordinated attack on it, or at least to have countries like the United States, the global leaders, to actually coordinate a massive global intervention, understanding that this pandemic is not a local affair. Now, we saw that in fits and spurts. I mean, you do get some of that. You had Operation Warp Speed under the Trump administration. You did have people in various levels of government reaching out with leaders in the corporate sector to kind of fast track vaccines. So you did see stuff like that. You did see massive private-public sector collaborations, often under the radar. But you always, as an analyst sitting back, you just go, "My God, I wish it could have been so much better." Yeah. There were also many times when policies were working at cross purposes or the coordination was not there. But in the United States, I mean, it's like I don't know how, if we want to theorize, I get the sense that people are very, very distrustful of centralized concentrations of power. I mean, if we were to permit Washington or Ottawa all these extensive powers, would they ever relinquish them?
Yeah.
Where does it take us? Are we on this slippery slope of whatever?
Yeah.
Maybe I'm willing to bear this lack of coordination in order for the longer run, to protect my local, right to govern locally. I mean, I don't know what sort of calculus people are making, but that's the only way I can kind of rationalize it. And maybe there's a bit of a trade-off there.
So in Canada, and especially in my region here, and in Kingston, if you want to get really down to sort of a microeconomic level, I mean, Kingston, and you're right. I mean, the fringe employment sectors of the economy, the service sectors, got hit the hardest, and that's where, I've said this before. The pandemic only exacerbated the disparities between the haves and the have-nots, mm-hmm. right? The marginals versus the non-marginals. And in Kingston, I don't know the exact statistic percentage, but a good chunk of our employment is government-based, institutional-based, vis-a-vis, the university, colleges, essential services, all that kind of thing. Same in Ottawa and across the province, and so that. That's where people didn't lose their jobs. The hardship they suffered was hunkering down in their home and staying full-time with their families and working from home and dealing with all of that. In the U.S., do you have do you have an idea in terms of how much government employment there is, and did that help buoy the sort of the reason why the economy's sort of maybe chugging along at a better clip than?
Let's see. So. The history here is the recent history. I mean, it's interesting. You kind of have federal and state level,
and that's why I'm saying there's layers there that.
During the financial crisis, I mean, it was pretty bad, because one thing that the states have what are these balanced budget kind of rules built in that. So they basically have to balance their budgets according to the state constitutions, which may or may not make a lot of sense in the long run, but they're very bad for emergency situations where, I mean, and when the crisis hit in 2008, I mean, states would see their state revenues decline, and to balance the budget, they'd lay off teachers, in the hospital workers. I mean, you're going, does this make sense?
Yes. Yeah.
The federal government is is less constrained in that manner because there is no such balanced budget requirement. And so if tax revenues decline, the federal government is more or less free to start issuing more treasury securities to finance deficit spending. Now, this time around, like I said, this time around was it is also the case, as it always is, as you describe. It's kind of people at the margins that get hit the hardest. People in the low-paying service sector jobs, leisure and hospitality being classic, got hit the hardest. But I do think in this case, in the United States, at least with the CARES Act, they really did come out and provide income support. And not only that, but also it required landlords to exercise forbearance on rental.
Yes. Yep.
And so and I think much of that was at the federal level, but there's also state level unemployment insurance as well. So
now, is that still ongoing? That care package, is that still in place?
Okay, well, don't hold me to it. But I think that's basically many of the main provisions there, as far as I understand, have been expiring going into the fall. There's still a state level unemployment insurance. And some states have cut benefits prior to others, but I think that support is slowly dwindling away. But the economy, the labor market in the U.S. has recovered actually pretty nicely. It's still not fully recovered, and there's still something like 4 or 5 million workers that are not employed that were employed pre-pandemic, but there's a number of hypotheses about why people aren't coming back to work. Some people have taken early retirement because actually, unlike the 2008 crisis, the stock market was booming. Yes. Real estate prices are going up. You're 55, 60 years old. Maybe you say,
it's time to cash out.
So there's that. There's, a lot of women with children in particular were hit disproportionately during the pandemic. And with these, the Delta variant coming, uncertainty with schools opening, maybe many women were choosing to stay home or compelled to stay home. Maybe that's holding things back a bit. And then there's, the possibility that these generous benefits are just are compelling younger workers, especially maybe not. Why should I go to work for whatever $10 an hour when I'm getting these benefits? Or I also was reading something about the YOLO economy. This you only live once, where people during the pandemic reassessed their life and what it meant and the role of work, and maybe they take vacations, world. Well, I guess that would be hard right now, but they're just reassessing the place of work in their life. So there's a lot of reasons I read that are explaining why the labor market hasn't fully recovered, but by and large, I think we're pretty close to it.
So, because here I know there's a lot of businesses struggling to get workers back. In those service sector jobs, right? And I think it does speak to everything you just touched on in terms of what's my alternative, what does that look like, and what are my priorities now? So, I know everyone here always says, oh, the Fed's or the U.S. is going to raise their rate or their whatever. And I know it's a bit of a different system here in terms of what our Bank of Canada sort of interest rate is, and then that depending on what happens there, then the big five or the lending institutions then decide where their retail rates are going, I guess. Where can you just touch on where that stands with you guys in the U.S. and what's the interest rate now, and what, like, if you go to get a mortgage now, because I know I think the mortgage systems are relatively the same, but I think there's probably some distinctions. But yeah, if you can touch on that would be great. So.
Well, these are the questions. I think I'm a little bit older than you, right, Luca?
I'm 66. I was born in 66. I'm 55 now.
So I'm a little bit older than you. But so I was I was working in the construction sector in Vancouver in the early 80s. Actually with your uncle, and interest rates hit 20% I recall.
Yeah. I wasn't around. I wasn't in real estate then, thank goodness. But
yeah, I saw real estate prices plummet by 30%. I actually got laid off in that recession. People were walking away from their homes, having to refinance at 15, 16, 70%. I mean, actually, it's when I went back to school, actually. So, yeah, so it's not that much different in Canada, the United States. The monetary policies are actually, if you study them, they actually follow pretty closely. It's not surprising. The economies are very integrated. But by and large, where we're at now in the United States is, when the pandemic hit, as I remember, we were just coming out, the economy was healing. The Fed was raising rates. I mean, the policy rate was wherever it was, probably above 100 basis points, and from a 25 basis points for a decade.
Right.
So interest rates were coming back, things were kind of normalizing, and then the pandemic hit, and so the Fed dropped the policy rate. The idea was, in a crisis, you want to make financing conditions as easy as possible. This is not the time to be, raising rates. So the rate was kept low, and there were a number of other measures taken. So at the time when the care package came, a number of people, myself included, warned. That we should brace ourselves for a period of inflation for a variety of reasons. I didn't foresee the supply chain disruptions, but I just thought, we're pumping in a lot of money, and the production levels are falling. It's going to be natural to see prices rise a bit, and this is kind of going to be a natural consequence of trying to help people out. To buy groceries when they're in need. So don't panic about it. It's likely that this inflation is going to be transitory. It turns out to be it's a bit more persistent than what a number of people have forecasted, myself included, because I really didn't take into account these ongoing supply chain issues that are kind of contributing to these price increases. So I guess the question going forward in terms of rates, which is what you really want to know, is how is the Fed likely to respond to the ongoing macroeconomic developments here? Labor market, the Fed has a dual mandate,
right?
Which is that the Fed sees itself as bound by congressional mandate to kind of keep inflation low and stable. We have an official 2% inflation target, but we also want to make sure that we establish or keep financial market conditions such that businesses kind of have easy access to credit, and that they can hire workers, and workers can enjoy the benefits of a robust economy. So there's kind of this balancing act. What we're seeing right now is if inflation continues to persist at very high levels, like 3, 4, 5% going forward, if this isn't just a temporary supply chain issue, the Fed's going to start, people at the Federal Open Market Committee, the governing body that sets the rates, are going to get a little bit nervous about their whether or not they're fulfilling their inflation mandate, and then you're going to see interest rates rise, and that's basically kind of how one should think about this. Is what are the forecasts of inflation going forward, and how persistent is this inflation going to be or perceived to be? If you have an answer to that question, then you'll have a pretty good idea of what the Fed is going to be thinking about in terms of raising interest rates. It's just going to be that classic thing. They're going to start raising rates, possibly aggressively, and I don't know. There's no other way to put it. I mean, the purpose of this is expressly to cool off the economy. Because there's this idea that these inflationary pressures are going to just lead to an unsustainable kind of recovery dynamic, and prices are going to start to rise too rapidly, and there's all sorts of reasons why people don't like inflation. They're worried about whether their wages are going to keep up to the price increases, and so the Fed would want to nip that in the bud. So that's I can't tell you what's going to happen, but I can tell you how the Fed would react if certain things happen.
Well, no different than here. And I know they're tracking inflation because, I mean, if you've gone to a grocery store recently or any retail outlet or Home Depot or whatever, the cost of goods are it's incredible. The simple increase in staples, just ordinary day-to-day staples, right? I mean, and I don't know enough about the supply chain issues to understand why exactly there's still that logjam. And I mean, obviously there's still, and I mean, we're in our little bubbles per se, but obviously the world is still, majority of the world is still in the throes of this pandemic and unvaccinated, vaccinated, and certainly at levels of vaccination that are far below, both U.S. and Canadian levels. And I think that's probably, if I had to guess, that's probably where some of the issues are arising when you can't get labor, you can't get, things like that happening when they're
well, that's right. Well, just take a look at what's happening in China, and then when you take one thing this pandemic has done, which I think is remarkable, it's just opened your eyes as to how complicated the supply chain is globally, how interlinked we are. And it is, I sometimes reflect, I mean, it is a miracle, Luca. We get up, and when I go to the store, I expect there to be bananas there.
Yeah.
In Kingston in the wintertime. How does that happen? I mean, it's
right.
and it is really a marvel of the coordination that does happen that permits this type of, global supply chains to supply our everyday wants and needs that we largely take for granted. If the virus now, the Delta virus has reared its head recently in China, they're shutting down production. This has an effect on shipping, right? I mean, they're not coming with their supplies, or these ports are clogged. I mean, you don't have the workers to unload the ships. You can't load the trains. The trucks aren't moving. I mean, this is how it works. It's like this chain reaction, right? And it's really, I think, opened the eyes of a lot of people to see how dependent we are. And by the ways, it's actually kind of, I think, also had the effect of re-questioning economists' faith in kind of free trade ideas. Yes. Especially in terms of critical goods or strategic goods, vaccines or masks or whatever. How wise has Canada been to kind of offshore its industrial capacity? Yeah. Because you're really relying on the rest of the world to help you out in a crisis, and normally things are okay, but if you don't have the capacity in a crisis, and I think this was an issue in Canada.
Well, and not to make this political, but when you make those points, the eerie specter, which you saw firsthand in your last president, is this whole mindset towards protectionism again, right? Yes. And towards keeping our borders our own, and U.S. What was the big Biden speech? Everything made in the USA, or keep it first in the U.S., right? Or and Canada to a certain degree too. But how many other countries globally are starting to think that way in terms of which goes back to your very one of the comments you made in the very beginning. I agreed with you, and some would say, "Oh, I'm too utopian and too let's all hold hands and sing Kumbaya." And it's not about that. I'm certainly I believe in a free market economy. I don't, but had the world come together, and all said no different than the countries did individually, like Canada did, like everybody's, okay, dummies, this is going to cost a bunch of money. Let's all just start spending money to keep everything, to keep the trains on time, to keep the ships moving, to keep the, you know what I'm saying? And anyway, but that's a conversation for a couple of bottles of wine and another time for sure. But
well, I mean, in that regard, just again to reiterate that point, I think you're right. in absent a kind of a global collaboration, I advocated, I said, here's a chance for the United States in particular, and the corporations, our corporate leaders, to step up. I mean, if I was in charge, I mean, since it's early in the morning, it's I've only had one cup of coffee, what a kind of like a Marshall Plan, what the United States did after the destruction of the Second World War. I mean, make this vaccine, they developed it very rapidly, great, the technology's amazing, but make it available for free around the world.
Absolutely. Right.
And the corporations step up. I mean, it's like the level of, first of all, it would have been good for yourself because you would have stemmed the global pandemic. This is kind of cynically, it would have been in your self-interest, one.
Right, and that's the short-sightedness. Yeah, that's sorry.
Second of all, think of the goodwill. Think of the goodwill. I mean, the projection of American power. This is what America is about. This is the model you should follow. We'll step up, and that occurred to some extent. But I'm just saying, what a squandered opportunity it was. Anyways.
Well, I won't keep you too much longer, but just a couple of other things I wanted to touch on. One is, I've obviously heard in the news, and there's this massive infrastructure plan that Biden's trying to get passed. And I was surprised to hear that there was actually two of his own that were not in agreement with it, and that was one of the stalls. But is that going to have any bearing on economic factors if it gets passed, if it doesn't get passed?
This is, I'm an economist, and I do have to keep an eye on political. But I mean, politics works in weird ways. So there's actually two parts. There's two bills. One is kind of, loosely is an infrastructure bill, the American Job Plans, which broadly includes infrastructure, broadband, things like that. That bill, which is kind of the smaller of the two bills, but still big, is actually had bipartisan support. Actually, the Republicans they got a majority, 60 plus votes in the Senate to support this infrastructure bill. So that was actually a go, and I thought that was going to go ahead. And by and large, it seemed like a reasonable thing. I mean, I didn't get into the weeds. When you get into the weeds, you kind of, what is that doing in there? What is that provision doing? But broadly speaking, there's a lot of talk about crumbling infrastructure, and who's going to argue against rebuilding infrastructure? It's really time to do that, according to many people. But what happened was the Democrats, especially the progressive side, there's a second part, another bill that's come out that's much more expansive. It has to do with expanding Medicaid, and increasing taxes, the Green New Deal. So it's really kind of a progressive wish list, and that doesn't have Republican support. It also doesn't have support within some of the moderates in the Democratic Party. So what happened was the progressives held up the bipartisan bill because they wanted to get the bigger package passed. So now there's a question of whether either bill is going to be passed. I don't know. And so what impact might this have? If the first bill gets passed, I think arguably that's going to be good because rebuilding things that need to be rebuilt, that's good. If it doesn't get passed, I don't know what happens. I don't know. If the states step up and rebuild the infrastructure at the state level, maybe that's a preferred solution for many. I don't know.
Yeah. Now, we're, nation, both on the federal side and provincial side and state side, everyone's worried about their debt. And I mean, I don't know what the U.S. debt is at, but trillions and trillions of dollars. And now through the pandemic and the spending that's happened, and again, not to put you on the spot or anything like that, but is it in a precarious situation? Is the U.S. on the brink of bankruptcy to sound sort of alarmist, I guess, or anything like that? What's the snapshot on that overview, I guess?
Right. Well, actually, I have actually written on this question, and in fact,
Oh,
I wrote something for in the Canadian context as well that was published in the Finances of the Nation, which I will send you a link, and perhaps your listeners would like
yeah.
to read that. I have a
Yeah, please.
corresponding piece for the United States. I mean, my take on it is a little bit different than, say, I straddle the radical middle here. The short answer is you shouldn't be too worried about it. There's no sense in which bankruptcy is going to occur either in Canada or in the United States, in the sense that what some people don't. Here's the thesis of the article: is many people project kind of their household finances to that of the government, the federal
Right.
government. And there's a lot of that analogy resonates with a lot of people, but it turns out that analogy is actually not that correct for the federal government. It applies to provincial, it applies to local, it applies to corporations. But for a country, especially like the United States, the debt that the United States issues, the U.S. Treasury security, is better viewed as a form of money. It's an interest-bearing money that it doesn't ever have to be repaid in the sense of it has to be repaid when it comes due, but you just issue new debt. So you roll it over indefinitely. And these U.S. Treasury securities actually play an essential role in the global financial markets because they're used effectively as a form of wholesale money.
Okay.
It's the same reason. Why do you hold dollars in your wallet?
Right.
These dollars are like, imagine I label this Canadian government debt. And you're going, oh my God, look at all this Canadian government debt in my wallet or in my pension fund. But you know what, Luca? We actually like having that stuff in our wallet. It helps us buy our Starbucks coffee. It helps us buy stuff. It's the same thing in global financial markets. They use these treasury securities to finance stuff. They use it as collateral. It greases the wheels of the global financial markets. This stuff lives in our pension funds. It's as a safe asset. I mean, and so there's the notion of you're in trouble or you're going to default. You don't have to default. I mean, because the federal level, you can print the money that these securities are promising. That's a sense in which you don't have to be too worried about default or things like that, as long as it's managed responsibly. What you do have to worry about is when there's excessive issuance is ultimately, my view is inflation.
Right.
Because while you don't have to default on it, you do have to kind of print money, I guess. And this, so you kind of implicitly default through higher prices. But that's far less scary than a mass. Is the United States going to default in the global financial system collapse? No, that's not going to happen. Okay. All that's going to happen in the worst case is inflation gets out of hand. There is the issue of the interest expense that the government would have to incur. But the interest expense has been very low on U.S. Treasuries. It's been very, very low. And that reflects the global demand for the product. I mean, people around the world are willing to hold U.S. paper at very low yields for the same reason you're willing to hold a Canadian dollar bill in your pocket that earns zero interest rate.
Right.
It's not a very great rate of return, but it helps you manage your payments and stuff. So that's the thing. So if you go to the article, I kind of hash it out there a bit. I'll say, be careful with the household analogy. It's not quite correct. You shouldn't be as concerned as many people are. On the other hand, it's not like we can't be unconcerned.
Right.
But the concern is mainly about the inflationary consequences of these policies. That's what it boils down to.
Oh, that's awesome, actually. That was very enlightening. I appreciate you commenting on it. Well, listen, we're creeping on. Well, actually, I just looked at the clock. We're doing well, but as far as because when the pandemic was in its full, when it was all happening and vaccines were just coming out and everything, I've stopped hearing about U.S. vaccination rates and stuff like that. And then you watch a football game on Sunday on TV, and it looks like the pandemic is over. I mean, I know this is out of your purview, but where are things in terms vis-a-vis COVID cases, people getting vaccinated? What's your observation? I'm puzzled because it looks like everybody's walking around like this thing is over, and I'm going, there's got to be people getting sick, aren't there? I mean, I don't know.
There are. I mean, it varies across the country. It's such a big country, as you mentioned before. I mean, there's 330 million people, 50 states, all sorts of, Hispanics, the different cultures, the French culture in Louisiana. I mean, the Puritans in New England. The Germans, the Quakers. I mean, there's just so many different cultures and attitudes. But I live in Missouri here, and Missouri is kind of one of these. So I went out to a restaurant with some friends out 40 miles, even less, maybe 40 minutes. Away from me, to a town called Defiance.
Wow.
And Defiance, Missouri, and it was a winery, and this was already last year, and it went out to the patio. It's all booming and stuff, and we're having a good time. And I noticed I take off my mask because nobody's wearing a mask. But I talked to the owner, and I go, "Geez, so how did you guys manage the pandemic? Did you kind of see a drop in business or anything?" And he said, "Heck no," although he didn't say heck. He said, "Heck no." It was like as if nothing happened. I mean, the attitude was just, don't mess with us. I mean, we're going to live our lives, and of course we're dying, but we're dying from all sorts of things. We're dying from opioid overdoses. The attitudes are heterogeneous, let's say, and in some parts of the country they're very much more like Canada. In other parts of the country are much. So it's.
And speaking with Rosemary, who's in Maryland, she said their governor was very proactive and done in her estimation, a really good job in terms of, restrictions and policies and things like that. But and then you hear stories like that, and then I guess it is what it is, right? So and
I think by and large, because talking to my mom and dad back in Vancouver, I mean, if things came back to normal much more for me than it did for them. I mean, I still wear masks actually at the supermarket, so people are masked. But I went out last night with friends, and there were no masks. I mean, so things have pretty much come back to normal. But the idea is, I actually did catch COVID in December.
Oh my goodness! I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was very mild. I don't know how I caught it because I was being careful. I managed not to infect the rest of my family. But so I've had the COVID, and I'm fully vaxxed. And so, what am I going to do? I mean, I feel like I'm more or less protected. I mean, I'm not fully protected, but you can't, live your life in fear of,
fair enough.
I mean, at some point you got to get out. And so that's roughly the attitude here. If you're afraid, you stay home. Okay. But we're slowly going back to work. I'm going back to work 3 days a week now. I don't know, how are things for you? Are you still home?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, we were fortunate where, everything is online platforms now. I mean, you don't have to meet with anybody to sign anything anymore. It's click, 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 and away you go. So I was able to work right off my laptop and from home. And we have a small brokerage here, so there's only a handful of us, and hardly, we certainly stayed distance and everything. And now we're here in Kingston. We're in a phase where, it's vaccine passports they're calling for, right? Or proof of vaccination to enter pretty much anything now, to be candid with you. They're even actually, and after our latest election, Trudeau and the Liberals then most of the provinces and the federal government are going to mandate that all their employees, that all the work get vaccinated. So there's some backlash to that, but at the end of the day, it's going through, and so we're taking a bit, I guess, firmer stance in terms of those types of policies for sure.
Right.
So.
Right. I think that makes sense because, if you have time, I hear stories from my friends in Alberta. The thing that people don't appreciate. So I appreciate personal rights and freedoms as much as anybody. But there is this thing that economists call externalities, where when you're doing your private cost benefit calculation, you're not factoring in your decisions on broader society.
Right.
Now, the way this manifests itself, I think, primarily is in this case is, I'm not especially afraid of getting COVID because I'm vaccinated. Doesn't mean it's impossible. But the way it's manifesting itself is actually the unvaccinated people are getting sick and they're clogging up the ICUs.
Yes.
They're taking resources that would normally be used to treat cancer patients or people, a number of elective surgeries. And it's like you're imposing a tremendous cost on your fellow citizens because you're not the medical resources have to be diverted to cater to your personal freedoms. I mean, you're actually not being very Canadian if you're not thinking about your fellow Canadians. So please consider, I respect your rights and freedoms. Sure, but understand that you are imposing a social cost. It's not like this is free for the country. So, I mean, that's kind of the point I would stress.
Yeah, no, and you know what? That's a point well made and certainly well voiced. So, well, you know what? I think we'll leave it there. I think that's a good positive way to end it. And again, I just want to say I am thrilled to have had you. Thank you so much for taking the time and all the best. Stay safe and send me that link. And let's stay in touch then for sure.
Luca, it was awesome. A great pleasure. It's going to be so nice. I want to come and visit. It'd be nice to see you again.
That would be amazing. That would be amazing. Absolutely. All right. Until then. Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.